Oh, nice. How's your wife time?
All right, I guess we can get started. Some people will probably trickle in. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Sandra Martinez, a founder and president of Fenix Leadership and Development. Sandra received her Master's of Arts in International Business and Latin Studies at Anderson School of Medicine, School of Management, and a PhD in Business Administration from New Mexico State University, and has more than 20 years experience working in strategic leaders in the U.S. and abroad. She provides excellent executive coaching and consulting with business, government, and not-for-profit organizations in the area of leadership, development, and organizational transformation. The process empowers leaders and teams to unlock new possibilities, adapt uncertainty, and catalyze meaningful, sustainable transformation. We'll learn more about her.
Thank you, Greg. We'll usually stand in the middle.
Wherever you want.
All right, well, as I was recalling to Marianne, that after 25 years of living on the East Coast, first in Philadelphia and then in Washington, D.C., with a 3-year stint in Central America, I returned to Albuquerque in 2021 during the pandemic. And then after working from a base for Fenix Leadership and Development, for 3 years, I realized I had business only elsewhere and none in New Mexico, and I wanted to put leaders here. So I started investigating the activities of Rainforest Innovation. So maybe those of you who have been more continuously in New Mexico have a sense that I spent the might be at some point in New Mexico in economic development. I attended some sessions talking about, or really highlighting the attention and the resources being put into quantum computing, and I hope and I trust that that energy will spill into other areas of economic development, including biotech in New Mexico. But what I want to say is this lends some urgency, I feel, is what I'm going to say today, because I feel it's important to use complexity-informed methods and processes to make sure that the way we approach decision-making and strategy is effective in the very complex systems in which we are a part. So I probably speak to a broad range of people, the knowledge that you have about complexity and nonlinearity. And I'm sure there's some people that are just being introduced to this here and some people that know far more than I do. But I'd like you to leave some idea of what nonlinearity is and emergence and what it means for your organization. We're really talking about knowledge management in the broad sense. Knowledge is not just embedded in one place or one person, it's a dynamic system. And leaders have a very important role in terms of catalysts to set up conditions in their organization so information and energy can flow. I hope all of you heard from this conversation with something that you can use for your organization, and also that we can all use for the ecosystem we're trying to build together for entrepreneurship. Here you see 2 siblings representing 14 generations in New Mexico. My brother Robert, to my right, in Northeast Albuquerque, where we grew up. My brother, some of you might know my brother David Martinez. He's been an attorney here for many decades. My sister's a book conservator. Robert went on to engineering at Princeton and Georgetown Law. And actually, my parents met right here at UNM. So when I was young, I was all about dance and music and art. And then as a young adult, I co-founded and co-directed a gallery of contemporary art in Santa Fe, representing Mexican artists and artists working in contemporary genres in the Southwest. So at this point, you might say, what does all this have to do with the theme of the day? Well, while in Santa Fe, I formed a close friendship with David Pines and his wife, Susie. David was a founder of the Santa Fe Institute. And on more than one occasion, I was a dinner partner with Marie Delmon. And these 2 physicists were gracious enough and generous enough to answer my question about the work they were doing. Later, when I pursued a doctorate in organizational science and leadership, I returned to conversations with David Pines because I could see that complex adaptive system was really a phenomenon, a dynamic, and a framework that was at play in my research and also with the organizations I worked with. And he said, Sandra, follow the emergence. So I guess I can say that I feel the trajectory of my career has been very unpredictable, and context and relationships shape opportunities. It's one of the themes of today. So after I earned a doctorate, the first school I taught at was the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And I did research on leadership with a large consortium of researchers, and we compared leadership across 67 societies. I worked with a boutique firm in scenario planning, and I continued my work in complex adaptive systems. In 2007,
Simon,
in 2007, the Office of the Secretary of Defense recruited me to be on the faculty as a transformation chair at the U.S. Army War College. And that was because of my interest and my background in complex adaptive systems and in leadership. After that experience, or after that tenure, I went to Central America, where I worked with leaders, female leaders, and also in civil society initiatives. And then when my husband and I moved back to the United States, we went to Washington, D.C. And at that point, I became familiar with the work of David Snowden, Jay Snowden. And he founded the Cynefin Group. It's ongoing now for 20 years. He founded the Cynefin Group to develop practical, useful tools based on complexity science to support leaders in decision-making and strategy initiatives. And I began working with them. We now have sort of community practice in the US, but the colleagues extend from Europe, Asia, and Singapore. Interestingly enough, the origins of one of the methods that I'm going to introduce you today, the sense maker, had its beginning at DARPA, the research branch of the DoD. And in post 9/11, they were exploring how to capture weak signals to understand better how insurgencies develop. In that era, it was Al Qaeda and similar insurgencies. So today, I'm going to nudge you in a direction that may feel non-commonsensical, because I'm shifting the assumption about organizational processes. And I'm going to ask you, if you will, to stay with me and suspend your judgment, not necessarily about me and how well I do at explaining these ideas, but about the ideas themselves. There's an error there. It should not be mechanistic, it should be mechanical. So I'm talking about moving from a more mechanical machine orientation of organizations to looking at organizations as adaptive and emerging and living entities, and moving from trying to having a goal of controlling and predicting and moving to influencing and shaping. So we've been taught to take things apart and look at individual elements of a phenomenon or an experience, assuming that after we understand the various parts, we put it back together and we understand the whole. And that's not the way complexity works. Complexity is about interaction, it's about emergence, it's about context. And so these ideas that I'm talking about have great implications for planning, for strategy, and for leadership. We learn from quantum mechanics that when you measure something, that measurement and that intervention becomes part of the phenomena. And in complex adaptive systems, we shape the system, not just through our actions, but through our beliefs, through our perspectives, through our emotional disposition. So returning to the idea of prediction, so it's not that we can't predict because we're ignorant of the facts. We can't predict because the system is indeterminate and it's emerging. So my major argument, one of my major arguments today is you as startup founders, as people in tech transfer, you're using advanced knowledge from science. But how many of you use principles from complexity science to shape your organizational design, to influence your leadership practices, or to use in strategy? Okay, this is sort of harsh what I'm going to say, but it's not original. It's taken from a recent and brilliant article on strategy by Clayton Fraser Williams, who's at Rhodes University in South Africa. And he said, consider a slime mold, in this case, I hope I'm saying this right, serum, polycephalin, and absent cognition or foresight, no neurons or no brain, it navigates a maze more efficiently than some executive teams. Okay, so maybe you have in mind an executive team that you worked with that had some of those qualities. But in other words, this slime mold is not surviving, I say thriving, by planning or design, but by this repeated process of moving toward things that are pleasant or desirable, like food, and retracting from chemicals and strong light. In reading about this slime mold, I thought it was interesting that neuroscientists and biologists studied this particular slime mold, which incidentally has been around for 600 million years, because it has primitive functions of decision-making and learning. And they're learning about this, more about decision-making. So I have some sympathy for these executive teams because it is a very confusing terrain. For 80 years, we've had brilliant theorists write about strategy and management. There's some of them here: Robert Simon, James March, Daniel Minsker, Mal and Prahalad. You've seen these names if you go into business schools. Clausewitz on war, fog of war, back into the 1880s. But one of the challenges is that early theorists assumed that an organization was stable, assumed that the environment was stable. And even back then it was not, or they wanted to stabilize the system. They wanted to work against the system to stabilize it. And then later theorists like Ralph Stacey or Kathleen Eisenstadt from Stanford, they acknowledged the uncertainty in the environment and the complexity of the environment, but they never landed on what is strategy. So this is a rather gnarly definition of strategy, but I will explain why I like it, and it's also borrowed from strategy is the means by which complex adaptive systems collapse probabilistic future into realized advantage under conditions of entropy. Okay, gnarly. Entropy is the measure of uncertainty in the system, the measure of disorder in the system. But the reason I like it is, number one, it refers to many domains. It refers to the geopolitics domain, it refers to the biological domain, it refers to artificial domain and the social domain organizations. And the other reason I like it is that phrase, collapsing probabilistic future, because that sort of relates strategy to what we know from physics, which is, and we are not just observers in the system, we're part of the system. And we know that when we intervene in the system, we do gain knowledge about the system. Now, in a strategic landscape, in a strategic setting, we have before us many possible actions, many multiple possibilities. It's only when we act that we collapse all those multiple possibilities into the reality in front of us. And in a way, we become co-creators of that reality. So I wanted to share that with you, and I wanted to emphasize that, again, that we are actors in the system and that we want to identify the factors in the system so we can make decisions about how to move forward. So looking at strategy this way, strategy is this process of sensing what's in the system, of interpreting or making sense of what you sense in the system, and then acting in it, and then hopefully adapting, being adaptable to the system. So I put in there cultivating coherence because I'm using the word coherence rather than alignment, which is used a lot in business and strategy, Because in my book, alliance is more imposed from above and it's more superficial. So coherence is what might emerge as you move through the collaborative actions to enact some of the actions that you've decided. And you talk to colleagues, you talk to other stakeholders, and you develop a trust, or you develop a shared purpose, shared meaning in what you're doing. I don't know, have any of you been in the military? Anybody served in the military here? You have. So if you were in the Air Force or the Marines, you might relate this to the OODA loop. You ever heard of OODA loop?
I vaguely.
Okay, so OODA loop was developed by John Boyd, who's a jet fighter pilot in World War II. And it refers to observe, orient, decide, and act. And that had to be a pretty fast cadence when he was in the air. He survived. But when he went back to Quantico, gathering today, when he went back to Quantico and he taught this loop as a decision-making framework in organizations, or he did that. When I was at the War College, I looked at that OODA loop, and I shifted a little bit, because that observe refers only to your sight, and sensing, you broaden how you are sensing your environment. And also organizations, it's not just interpersonal sensing. You've got to set up systems so you can see the patterns that are going on in your organization. Patterns of thinking, stories people are telling each other, emotional disposition, enthusiasm, burnout, trust, whatever. And you want to find out what's going on. You want to have some means of finding out what's going on in your environment. And then the orient of OODA, which is sort of the interpretation phase in the sensing, interpreting, acting, and adapting. That's a very important step in the process, because that interpretation is what you derive your insights from, which leads to decisions. And so in that interpreting phase, you need to have multiple voices, multiple points of view. Otherwise, you risk your decision being biased and not being a sound decision. So I called it SODOR. I think John Boyd. Reflection was embedded in that learning process of OODA. So it was, for me, it was sensing, orient, decision, act, and reflect. And one of my colleagues who's in Singapore, and she just collapsed it into sensing and adapting. So it doesn't matter what you call it, or exactly how many steps you want to isolate, but being intentional about moving through those steps, I feel, is very helpful to you picking up patterns, making good strategic decisions. And the methods that I will present today are designed to help leaders sense what's going on in their strategic landscape, to plan their next move, essentially to help leaders identify and act on the most promising next moves. I have TS Nano's permission to say I've worked with them with one of the methods that I'll present later today, which is the affordance mapping. And I don't know what else I was going to say about that. But I do sense that what you do at Rainforest Innovation and the conversations that take place, for example, at the Q Center, the Q Station, not Peel, contribute to this loop here, the conversations and the interactions. Getting response. Oops. No, I don't. Okay, so I guess you'll have to watch that video on your own, on your own time. But it's a video of the beautiful flock of birds making patterns in the sky. And I think probably some of you have seen that used as an example of emergence, how adaptive behavior with no centralized control emerges from just simple rules that birds follow about separation and coherence. And somehow through these simple rules, they get to where they need to go, they find food, they avoid predators. And it's based on some simple rules. Now, just a caveat, not all complex adaptive systems are based on simple rules. So the next slide, I wanted to highlight emergence in different systems, the stock market. We see over the course of a quarter or even a day, we see individual actors making decisions. They have different motivations, different values, and we look at our investment portfolios or retirement funds at the end of each day and see what the result was of those interactions during the day. COVID viruses are complex adaptive systems. They're very adaptable. They're very resilient. And we think that COVID itself likely developed from the interaction, its emergent from the interaction of wildlife, intermediary hosts, and humans. And then the other representation of emergence is how we came together locally and globally to understand better what was causing COVID and how to contain it. In the social political arena, I don't know if you recognize Shirley Chisholm there. She was the first African-American congressperson elected in 1968. So the emergence of her success being elected from the 12th District of New York was a combination of the influences going on at the time, powers of the time, her actions, and the actions of her team. And on the far left, I think that's a qubit, I'm not sure, but it's some type of magnified hardware from quantum computing. Now, I don't understand much about quantum computing, but it is deterministic and linear. But what is a complex adaptive system about it is the ecosystem around it. So we'll see what emerges from the activity in quantum computing here. And there are many examples of emergence in the entrepreneurial world, like Dropbox, for example. Dropbox, I don't know if you know the story, and I don't know how many years ago this happened, but they just posted a video on social media, their proof of concept, and then there was all this response and interaction among customers, and they got money, and then what emerged was this cloud storage system that we all use.
NVIDIA is an example of emergence.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So again, I don't know how many of you have just talked about nonlinearity, but nonlinearity is when you have a very this is a characteristic of complex adaptive systems, and why you want to be attentive to weak signals or outliers, because a very small input can enter the system, and then it moves through the system, interacting with various elements of the system, and it amplifies in force and size. For example, what's pictured here is what happens when there's a spark, a fire in dry grass. It just amplifies through the system, and it can destroy millions of acres of property in wildfire. I think we've all seen a lot of examples of the viral tweet. When something's posted on social media, a customer may post a negative review, and it becomes viral, and it really impacts the trajectory of the company. There can also be very positive sort of nonlinear effects when a junior associate in a company has an idea for an innovation, and it's accepted, and it moves, and it amplifies, and it becomes a very important cornerstone of innovation in a particular company. And I think most of us have heard of the metaphor of the butterfly effect, which is a nonlinear example about weather, which is very hard to predict. A butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil. Moving through the system, it not only does it with a lot of other factors causes a tornado in Texas. So one thing that it was really hard for me to get my head around was that context is causal, right? Context is causal through the constraints that are in the system, right? So the constraints shape our behavior. And that's all I wanted to say about that slide. So that's why we want to really identify the constraints in a landscape to move on and make decisions about how to act in the system. And feedback loops are very important. They facilitate that continuous learning and adaptation. And so again, the role of the leader, for leadership in an organization is to create the conditions for communication, for collaboration, for listening, for learning, and watching how, when you choose to act in a certain way, what is the result, and adapting based on that. Because if something good is happening, you want to amplify that. If something not desirable is happening, you want to catch it and self-correct it. And then I'll speak to constraints because I began to mention that word. So constraints in a system can either be enabling, right? Constraints can help you. There's value in constraints in that they can help focus your effort, and within a boundary, creativity can flourish and you can be innovative, right? Let's think of a constraint, a cultural norm, or a budget, or a protocol, right? So that can be an enabling constraint that moves you toward a desirable goal. But over time, what's enabling can become limiting if it is institutionalized in a way and it sort of governs a behavior and you can't be adaptable. How am I doing on time?
Yeah.
Okay. So are you reading me? Yeah. Okay, good. Because I know there's just a broad range of background in this and so forth, and I know it's different. So what about concrete things you can do in your organizations to really be more adaptive, use the principles and complexity, and move forward towards your desirable outcome?
I think one of my favorites is to talk about remaining focused on our core competency.
That is a constraint, right? An enabling constraint. Is that what you're thinking about? So what Carrie Ann said is remaining focused on our core competency or
Competency, yes.
So I would say identify your desired direction rather than exert a lot of time in envisioning retreats in that aspirational goal in the future. Because if you do that, focus on that goal, you're assuming a linear path to that goal. You're not accounting for everything that might happen as you move toward that goal, nor the learning that could take place, all right? So you're leaving yourself a little bit at risk in doing that, an expenditure of your energy, or you might miss opportunities. I would say instead of that, explore your strategic present, right? Those things I'm talking about, look at the constraints, the agents, the elements that are available to you, that afford possibilities to you. The individual agents, or humans in your group, the groups, the organizations, people, the rules of thumb, the cultural norms, the relationships you have with all of your stakeholder groups, processes, rituals, ideas, identities. Professional identities shape behavior in organizations. And there are other types of identities at play in our organizations right now. And look at our technical systems. How do they enable us? How do they limit us? Your systems architecture, the algorithms that we might not be examining close enough that are written into our platforms. So here I tried to categorize, so I begin to talk about constraints and the elements in your strategic landscape. So they're the agents, the human agents and groups of agents, and they have intentionality and goal-driven behavior. The constraints, the things that I've been talking about, the rules, the boundaries, the conditions that shape behavior. And then just to make it more complicated, we threw in another type of element, which is a constructor, just looking at things that transform you, like rituals or an idea. There's a contagion. So constraints shape what is possible and what is unthinkable in the organization. And here are some examples of constraints: the presence and the impact of a team lead, cultural norms and meetings. A lot of people are having trouble with too many meetings right now, but participated dialogue in meetings, the values held by important stakeholder groups in your industry, right? If you're designing a product that doesn't match with the value of many of your stakeholders, that's a constraint. And you need to think about how to address that. And don't forget emotional dispositions, right? Enthusiasm, burnout, trust, fear of failure. So I just want to introduce this concept of adjacent possible, and it was coined by Stuart Kaufman, who was at the Santa Fe Institute. He was an evolutionary biologist. But we use it in social systems, in strategy, to think of what are the set of realistic, achievable next steps that are close to the current state of the system. All those things we talked about. The dispositional state that are reflected in your system, the attractors, the constructors, and energy gradients. So it's useful, this adjacent possible, but because it keeps you from overextending yourself, from overreach, right? And it can inspire innovation because you're looking at nearby opportunities. And then I wanted to emphasize the importance within this framework of taking iterative, smaller steps so that you can, from insights, you might form a hypothesis about how people are interacting, or one thing's causing another, and you can test those hypotheses. You can reduce risk by forming a portfolio of micro actions, right? So you spread your bets across multiple things. And you can interact with the people that are helping you with these projects to develop that cohesion that I was talking about. So you learn from each other, you develop trust, strengthen the relationships. If you like books that don't talk down to you, this is a great one. Context Changes Everything, Alicia Guerrero. She's a philosopher of science, and she really addresses the physical science that lies behind this application in social systems and its relationship to strategy. And she talks about constraints being causal. But what I wanted to emphasize again was the important role of leader and leadership in setting up the conditions for feedback, the conditions for the flow of information and energy, and setting up the enabling constraints, setting the system for enabling constraints. So we've talked about the mechanisms of how you can be more adaptive, the feedback loops, not only setting up a process of feedback, but making sure that you're creating the cultural climate that people are listening, soliciting feedback, adapting, taking safe to fail risks based on what they've learned. The sense making we've talked about, and the distributed cognition, that knowledge is in a community. It's not in one person, it's created by interaction. So you probably guessed that I really believe that looking at methods and tools that are based on, I believe that complexity science is the most advanced and the best framework we have to design, to base our decision making on in our strategy. And here I've represented some, it's not all inclusive, and I've drawn a lot from Dave Snowden and the Canova Company, but I've represented on the left different ways of gathering people for conversations to encourage sharing of knowledge and insights, anecdote circles, entangled trios, and complexity facilitation. And then on, did I say left? That's great, on the left. And then on the right, several methods that might include some of those processes. Dependency matrix, which I've used in healthcare, sense maker, which I've explored with the Department of Defense, and affordance mapping that I'm using more and more with tech companies and startups. Pagoda and Ashen, we don't have time to go into those now, but I'm happy to tell you what they are. They're just mnemonics, and each letter represents something to be thinking about, right, as you move into these processes. For example, the first A in Pagoda is anomaly. Really be attentive to anomalies that are developing in your system. So I think I forgot to say that I will be describing briefly affordance mapping and the sense maker. So why affordance mapping? Because by exploring what's in your ecosystem, you're making more likely that you're gonna move in the direction that you want it to move. And we don't wanna look at just what we can easily see or what's superficial. We wanna go below the surface into the substrate to see what's going on. And you can then design actions, identifying what is more easy or what you want to shift or shape and what might be easier to do so in the short term, taking into account complexity principles. So these are just representations of all we've been talking about that are in the ecosystem, they're in the strategic landscape. Agents with goal-oriented behavior, those things that do not have intentionality, but we as humans embed some sort of intentionality and goal and perhaps bias, for example, in our AI decision support systems, rules, boundaries, conditions, SOPs, or our norms around decision-making, identities, professional and otherwise, SOPs. So you can see this is really about surfacing things that you might not be thinking about that really impact your system, your business. And then transforming elements. So what is affordance mapping? So we start with conversation with the client, with the organization, with the guiding team. What is an issue or a question that you really want to address, right? And then we gather materials, and this can happen online or in a benchmarking session. We gather materials and their observations or micro narratives that are prompted by a question related to that issue that you want to inquire about. And then once all those materials are gathered, then, and this can happen, the second step can happen beforehand or during a workshop, you then look at those observations that are written down or micro narratives, and you pull from them all those elements we've been talking about. What are the emotional dispositions that are reflected? What are the relationships that I'm seeing? What's an idea that's emerging over and over? Or what's a norm, a cultural norm that we might not have been aware of? So you're going to pull all of those things, and then you write them down individually, the individual ideas on Post-its, and you should take them down to a level of granularity where there's just one idea and also there's some agreement about it, about what that item is. And then, and this process can be designed in a lot of different ways. You have a lot of freedom based on the constraints and the desire and what the client is looking for. I usually, I forgot earlier to tell you that the E on the y-axis is energy. So that energy can be financial capital, it can be people, it can be political capital, social capital, and the x-axis is T, or time it takes. So you have all these sticky notes, and the way we did it at TS Nano was we had 3 teams, we had a grid for each team, and each team had that whole collection of elements, constraints, agents in front of them. And then they have discussions to place based on the coordinates for that particular element of energy necessary to change that item and time it would take, without regard for the desirability of changing. Do you see the difference? So you just put it on that map. And that engenders so many huge conversations and greater insight to what's at play in this, what's important. Are you with me here? Yes.
You know, especially the first slide is parallel to what MIT would call primary market research. So, you know, in a startup, they talk about understanding your customers, segmenting and zeroing in. That's a lot what the first slide is.
Are you talking about this one?
No, the one before.
Yeah. And I guess I wonder, what is your name, sir?
John.
John. So I'm wondering if they're digging into the substrate with as much detail to all these various elements. in that process. That would be my question. But
I don't think so,
yes,
but
you're seeing a
but-
parallel.
yeah, all I'm saying is there's a parallel and you're dealing with a lot more factors, you know, the organization. They're mainly concerned about, hey, who's gonna buy? How much are they willing to pay? And
Which are important
can we segment down to a small group to do tests? But this slide is very parallel to their approach.
Thank you. So we've placed the elements here. And then I asked the teams to mark one line to separate out on the upper right what are just, from our practical purpose, not changeable, right? So those are the givens. Then the second line demarcates those things that can be changed, but they're not in your power, the team's power, the organization to change them. We call that liminal. And then the third line marks things that are so volatile. You maybe just want to stabilize them. Maybe you don't know what would happen if you mucked with them, so you're just going to leave them there. And so what occurs is you have between the blue line, that second line there, and the red line, you have this area where you can identify safe to fail actions or experiments, right? Which you can then decide are important to you, or you want to move forward. At this point, you might want to consider what has the greatest impact, and that might help you decide where you want to go. You can put together a portfolio of micro actions. You can configure it in different ways. And then you also might, what's desirable is to think of how you might monitor your progress on those actions, so you're staying on top of it. And then this is just a chart to think about all the ways you might act in relation to that element on your map. Of course, you might decide you really want to change it. You want to make that commit to change it, but you might decide, wow, we just want to monitor that. Or you might decide this is really destructive. We want to really dampen that, try to destroy it. We might just want to research it. Or we might want to try to manage it in that we want to increase or decrease the effort it would take to change it. So this is just to remind you, there's a number of different ways to act in the system. So that is affordance mapping in a nutshell. And I find working with clients that it just it stimulates a deep discussion that provides a lot of insights for the participants into the dynamic of their organization.
Sandra,
Yes.
the other part of it that was useful was that there was more than one group doing it.
Mhm.
And so the discussion about the
Very
differences
good point.
was really
Yeah. Thank you, John,
insightful.
for bringing that up. Did everyone hear what John said? Because there are 3 teams doing that. That's a really important point that I forgot. And so to discuss the differences between the teams was really useful.
Mhm.
So the sense maker. So the sense maker, and that's a registered trademark of Cynefin. The sense maker is a distributed ethnographic method, and is designed as an alternative to those Likert-based surveys that we do that really don't provide very rich data, or immersive interviews, or focus groups. There's bias written into all of those. So it's designed to reduce the bias, and it's an online platform. And again, you begin by discussing what is the question or the issue that you want to explore. And then the sense maker is designed first by designing a prompt to elicit a micro narrative from the user that goes online. And then that prompt is followed by questions for that user, not an ethnographer or any expert, to make sense of that narrative. They interpret their own narrative, right? And you can do this with 25 people or 15 or 18,000 people. So it's designed to really capture and then visualize patterns in front of you, because you can ask questions about demographics, any lawful question about demographics, geographic location, gender, tenure, and so forth. So then you can aggregate what you see in a lot of different ways to look at patterns. I really like, this is a very clever way. This is one of the ways that the follow-up questions are designed, and these are called signifiers. But in contrast to a Likert-based scale, you know, those questions, they say A, B, C, D, to this extent or various things, where you sort of feel locked in to answer it in a particular way. These questions are designed carefully so that within that triangle and the three descriptions on those three corners, you capture almost every theoretical possible way and every practical way of answering that in the context. So on the far left, it says which needs were being addressed, business needs on the top, technology needs, or people's needs. And then the user can move the cursor to any place in that signifier. And then what you can do on the platform is you can go to any collection of dots, pull that out, relate it to the stories that were told, or even the various groups, and contrast how different groups answered. So it allows for a lot of different explorations. And you can highlight areas of agreement, disagreement, and you can see emerging themes. So going back to this first drawing, and I'm sorry, I don't know, I mean, this is abstract and then I don't know what was on the Y or X axis, but so the contours and the dots represent patterns of data, and you could say that that light blue dot in the far right is the desirable direction you want to go, and those these dots that are surrounded, I don't know if you can see them quite, those would be the adjacent possibles, the desirable stories or dispositions that you would like to see more prevalent in your organization. And then these arrows are, gee, how might we create interactions or environment to move this group up toward those stories? That's one way to look at it. So that's a very, very brief description of a rich method. So I've endeavored to give you some fundamental principles of complex adaptive systems and move into ways, concrete ways you might apply them in your organizations, including methods. And I leave you with these 5 statements. Embrace uncertainty and unpredictability. It's to your advantage. Recognize emergence as a core dynamic. Pay attention to context, relationships, interdependence, interaction. Take time to explore what's in your strategic presence to see what's afforded you, and support adaptive, iterative approaches to decision-making and change. And then following this, I've listed, and I'm not going to read them to you, but I've listed just some guidance that I pulled from the whole presentation that might be helpful to you. And well, you can see the first one is adopt a strategy and decision-making processes that reflect an up-to-date understanding of complexity, map the landscape of influence, maintain a vigilance about outliers, model the system, not just the desired income, but outcome. And don't forget that don't measure just actions and outcomes, but look at dispositions that are reflected in your system. Build feedback mechanism designed for coherence, compliance, and use what you have. Be aware of what you have. You might be able to recombine it in a different way. So I'm happy to share slides with you if you want to leave your email, and I'm happy to take questions now.
I was thinking about that sensing one. It's almost like a way of doing critical thinking for you.
Oh, the sense maker?
Yeah, but in a way that's gives you like more, because there's more players than just yourself. So it's like, I felt like it almost looks like it's a critical thinking exercise, but with a lot of input.
Yes.
It looks really cool.
Yeah, it is very cool. And the data is very rich. And then the way you can combine the data, what you can pull out of it to see patterns, and then your critical mind goes, wow, what's the insight from this?
It's a way to look at your own thoughts without the bias and have it feedback.
Yeah, it is designed to cut down bias,
Yeah.
because if you have an expert go in a regular ethnography, so it has the qualitative advantages of an ethnographic process, but it is qualitative and quantitative data. Even an ethnographer has a built-in, actually I was trained as an ethnographer as well, but an ethnographer is trained not to impose their bias, but we do. We all impose our bias. So it's really designed, and well, Dave uses this word. He said it has epistemic justice. In other words, you're giving the person that's participating the authority to make their own interpretation, and then you would come in, Carrie Ann, as sort of a leader in an organization to say, oh, okay, this is interesting, and I'm drawing this insight. And one thing I forgot to mention about the sense maker, generally what you do is, the leadership team and the consultant would make their first draft results, and then you go in and you have a complexity facilitation, and you say, with the participants or many people in the organization, you say, well, here's what you thought, what do you think? Here's what we thought, what do you think? And you bring sort of that distributive cognition into play. So help us make sense of this so we can decide what's important and how to move forward. Yes.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about clarity on one of your slides you had where you showed energy and time.
Sure.
That one. So what are the placement of the dots, colored things? Those are different statements or questions?
Okay, yeah, in this question, they could be, right? And sometimes they are, and sometimes it's just too complicated. You remember, Gary Ann, we just didn't pay attention to the, well, no, I had brought in different colors, but it sometimes gets confusing. That's a very good question. They can represent, different categories of elements that we're using.
Okay.
They can, but they don't have to. So that's a good question.
So to my question for clarity, so in the lower left, there's I think looks like a red, a blue batter. Is that?
The lower left, you're talking about right here?
Yeah, and below the line, those two items. Is that a minimal amount of time and a negative energy?
So I'm going to go back to Knevin and ask them that, because my interpretation when I just look at that is it's somehow going to give energy to the system, but it's still volatile. Because here you're talking about the amount of energy it takes. I would say that my interpretation would be it gives energy, but it's also volatile.
We had some like that. We had
Yes, you did.
chemical underneath.
But that's a good question for me to take back to my colleagues and say, like, what does that mean? Good question.
There's two online. The first one is, can you talk about when power hierarchies among participants have interfered with the
So those, that's a really good question, because those types of facilitations that I mentioned and to talk about entangled trios, complexity facilitation, and anecdote circles. It's the role of the facilitator to be trained in complexity facilitation to diminish those sorts of, you might say, power struggles, because you want people to feel, I guess I could use the term psychological safety in expressing what they're thinking, right? You don't want that to play out because you're diminishing the amount of information that you gain. So that comes forth in the skill of the facilitator and the design of the facilitation technique.
The second one was more of a comment, but they said, we've been discussing the detrimental consequences of startups taking investment too early. The following action item you mentioned for startup hold off on irreversible commitments and sufficient information just lapse into action seems to concur, so that is interesting, something we may want to discuss.
That's a very interesting comment because, and we have some entrepreneurs here, that have more experience than I, but VC capital can be enabling or limiting, right? So timing is important and a deep consideration of the impact that will have on your ability to grow and for the original players to benefit from their action. And also, my understanding is VC capital is supposed to come in early and have a risk. So you want to make sure that risk benefit calculation is viable. I don't know if that answers the question or if any entrepreneur here wants to chime in.
Well, I agree with what they're saying because things are path dependent, which your
Yes.
slides say. And so once you make a decision, that could be about a co-founder or taking capital, your path is somewhat limited going forward.
Thank you, John. And I, I didn't mention path dependency. I just put it in.
It was
It
on
put it
there.
in the final statements, but path dependency especially plays out with startups. And when I work with startups, I'm always telling the leaders, be very cautious or attentive and intentional about the norms you're setting up. Because once those norms are set up, like if you accept VC capital, your path forward is going to be very difficult to change.
A lot of it depends on the industry you're in. I was at a different startup than this one, and the industry had deep pockets. So even though the company never did what it set out to do, it still continued for a very long time because they just adapted into a different role in the industry.
Yeah, it sounds like you're describing a situation where there's a little bit more slack because there was more capital.
But what happens then too is the further and longer you go and the more money you get, the less control you have as the entrepreneur starting it.
Mhm.
So you're either going to exit or you're going to be controlled.
So one of the typical things you have to do in a startup is do a plan, financial plan. And I'm interested how you would meld these concepts into the plan. I know what I do right now. And I know, I use MIT as an example as entrepreneurs. They have this Charlie Tillett spreadsheets, which are completely deterministic. And there's not any variance around where, the financial projections go. So I'm interested, how would you meld these concepts?
Great question, John. And because I have some ways of responding to that, but I'm wondering, what's your first inclination?
Well, I'm communicating with Bill Allett right now, who's the head of MIT. And basically, you'd use probabilistic measures, and it's it's pretty straightforward. If somebody's buying something, it's a plus on distribution, and so what you get away from the determinism, because what the determinism does is people who are looking over your shoulders, which is everybody who's invested, can start ripping your plan apart because it's your plan. Your actuals are never going to look like.
Yeah. So I like to think about that for a little while, but the first things that come to mind is how can you do that plan without committing to this aspirational goal in the future that can prevent you from seeing things that are happening at the present, right? And prevent you from looking at what's actually afforded to you in the present. So that's one way. And then how do you maintain your adaptability within that plan? So, I mean, I'd love to talk to you about it later because I think how this melds with things that are in the conventional, sort of a more conventional approach would be useful for people. Because one thing I forgot to mention was what's the spread of this? What is the spread and diffusion of this sort of way of doing things? This is not taught in business schools.
No,
And I've looked at what, and my colleagues agree, I've looked at what the major consulting groups have put out, and they talk about complexity. They're published on complexity. They don't understand what they're talking about. They really don't have a deep understanding. So where is this used now? It's used, there's a lot of use in public policy, in the public sector. There's a lot of use of it in healthcare, especially in Europe. There's a growing use of it in the tech sector, in change management initiatives, and in finance. Right?
In finance, in what way?
I haven't been involved in this,
Okay.
but Kevin has.
Okay, I mean, I just want to tell you, I read a lot of books on entrepreneurial strategy. This is a quantum leap above what I've been reading.
Quantum leap in a good way.
Yeah, in a great way.
Yeah.
And I, you know, it's hard to take it all in.
Well, I appreciate your patience. You know, it's the first time I've attempted this in New Mexico, so I appreciate it. You know, I think for individual startups can use it. I feel like it could be used for policy development within the ecosystem in New Mexico, for those that are deciding policy, to bring in a lot of different stakeholders, maybe do a sense maker exercise or an affordance mapping, because it gives you, first of all, it's a deep consideration of all the factors, and then you can see patterns and make decisions.
It seems to be a buy-in from people involved.
Yeah, more buy-in, and I like to use the word even beyond buy-in, more commitment and sense of involvement, right, to move forward.
I think we're out of time. You guys stick around a little bit to the question. So let's thank Sandra.
Okay, so.
Question I'm gonna ask very much today, on this, if you don't vote.
Say,